Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the 10 longest books I've read. So I put up a video yesterday talking about my evolving thoughts about reading long books. So I used to really enjoy reading long books. But more and more nowadays, I find myself gravitating towards shorter books for a variety of different reasons that I talk about in that video. But yeah, I used to love long books. And this list, putting together this list of the 10 longest books I've read, definitely reflects that. A lot of the books here are books I read like 20 plus years ago. I think there's only one that I've read in the last kind of 3 or 4 years. So yes, I'm going to go through this list with you. I will do it in ascending order. So from the least long book, albeit that even that one is nearly 1,000 pages, through to the longest. The longest is probably one people will be able to guess. So have a think now and see if you can guess what the longest book I've read is. I suspect that you can. There are some repeat authors in here. There's 2 authors who are in this list more than once. You'll definitely be able to guess who one of those authors is, but I'd be surprised if you could guess who the other one is. If you've watched a lot of my videos, you may pick up on the other author because it is someone I've mentioned before, but it's definitely not someone I've talked about in any kind of depth on the channel. And there is at least one book here which I think people will be surprised that I've read, or maybe they won't be. Anyway, let me go through that list with you. So the first book is by an author who makes this list 3 times. This is an author whose books I used to really enjoy. I haven't read anything by him for years. In fact, he died a good few years ago now. I sometimes feel like I would be interested in trying one of his books again and seeing if I enjoy it. Anyway, that author is Tom Clancy. So yeah, there are 3 Tom Clancy books on this list. I couldn't tell you anything about any of those 3 books. I've read like most of the books he wrote when he was alive. I've read most of his books. I haven't read, I don't think, any of the books that have been published kind of with his name on since he died. But yeah, they're all a bit of a blur, to be honest with you. I couldn't tell you the details of any of the individual books in the Jack Ryan series. But if you don't know, the Jack Ryan series is a series of books that starts with The Hunt for Red October. And in that one, Jack Ryan is a young CIA analyst who ends up getting involved in he gets like parachuted or helicoptered onto this submarine that's been stolen by a Soviet submarine commander who's trying to like defect to the West. And Jack Ryan's story over, the whole series of books evolves from, his early days as a low-ranking CIA analyst to him rising up through the ranks of the CIA and ultimately becoming president. So it's an interesting and fun series of books. I doubt that Tom Clancy would be as big today if he started his career today. There was just something about, I think, the kind of world of politics and geopolitics in particular, when he became successful in the 80s, that meant there was a big appetite. People wanted to read books that were about the end of the Cold War, really, and what was happening geopolitically, that felt like they were written with a degree of authenticity. So, Clancy clearly, knew some stuff about what was going on and was able to talk about it in an informed way, but also write these thrillers that were quite exciting and entertaining, albeit always hugely long, or generally hugely long. I mean, his books are incredibly long, and I don't remember them feeling like a slog when I was reading them, but I feel like they probably would do if I were to read them now. So anyway, the first of those on this list is Debt of Honor. As I say, I couldn't tell you what that's about. I think it's one of the ones that features the character John Clarke and is more focused on John Clarke. So John Clarke was kind of a side character who becomes more comes more to the fore in the books as they progress. Anyway, next book is the one that I suspect may be a surprise to people. And sorry, Debt of Honor is 990 pages, and I've taken the page list the page counts just from Goodreads. So obviously different editions will vary. The next book then is 994 pages, so just slightly longer. And that is Old Sins by Penny Vincenzi. So Penny Vincenzi is, I think, a British author who writes these big kind of family saga, kind of potboiler type books, with kind of a bit of romance, a bit of intrigue, a bit of melodrama. Old Sins, from what I remember, and I read it probably 10 plus years ago, is about a guy who sets up like a fashion empire or something like that. So it's that kind of book. And I remember it being, entertaining. I think it takes place over a long period of time, which kind of justifies the length to an extent. But yeah, Penny Vincenzi, not an author I've gone back to. I haven't read anything else by her. Next book then is the author you were probably expecting to see on this list, Stephen King, and that is The Dark Tower, which clocks in at 1,050 pages. So the final book in the Dark Tower series, a series I've read recently. So actually this is another one that I've read recently. So yeah, read the Dark Tower series recently, or finished it. Have put up a video about the whole series, which you can watch if you so feel inclined. I thought this was a good end to the series. I thought it was a decent end to the series. I like the way he wrapped things up. And it, being as it is kind of epic fantasy, it does just about justify its length. I mean, 1,000 plus pages is a lot for any book, but I think there's something about King's writing which, despite the fact it can be, and it often is, really exciting, really tense, there's also kind of a slow pace to his books and an amount of detail in his books that means you kind of don't mind the length, or I don't mind the length anyway. So yes, that's book, the third shortest book on this list. And actually it's joint third, because the next book is Battlefield Earth by L. Ron Hubbard, which Goodreads tells me is also 1,050 pages long. So Battlefield Earth is a book I read when I was, I think, about 12. So I remember finding it in a bookshop when I was on holiday somewhere and thinking, wow, that looks like a really exciting sci-fi book, and particularly being impressed by how long it was and thinking, wow, it would be a real achievement to finish a book that long. So I read it and I remember enjoying it at the time. People who've watched the channel for a while may remember I tried to reread it recently. I tried to reread it last year and completely failed. I got about 300 pages through it and it's just so drawn out. Brandon Sanderson, the fantasy author, is a really big fan of this book and says it's like watching a Hollywood action movie. And it kind of is. I kind of get where he's coming from, but it's like watching a Hollywood action movie that's 10 hours long. It's just so drawn out. It's so long. There are, some decent action sequences in it, but it's not great. It's about, as the title suggests, it's about an alien invasion of Earth that has taken place some time before the events of the book, and it's about a kind of growing human resistance trying to fight back against the aliens. Next up then, another Stephen King book, It, which is 1,090 pages long according to Goodreads. So this again is one that I read probably not that long after Battlefield Earth. So it came out, I think, in 86, and I remember reading it in hardback. A hardback I got out of the library, so I'm guessing I read it in either 86 or 87. So a couple of years after I read Battlefield Earth. I've reread it 2 or 3 times, I think, since then. I think it going back to what I said about King before, he's someone who, because of the kind of incidental detail almost that he fills his books with, but they somehow feel like they add to the richness of the books. You kind of immerse yourself in a Stephen King book, don't you? And I definitely feel that's the case with it, particularly with the dual timelines and things like that. But it's a book where you feel like you end up feeling like you lived in Derry for the duration of the book. So a book I think is really, really good. Clearly there are a number of problems with it, including that weird scene towards the end. But there's a lot that's fantastic about it. So a book I wouldn't be surprised if I don't reread it at some point in my life. I think I may have phrased that wrong. I will probably reread it at some point in my life. Next up then, a fantasy book. So I've talked before on the fantasy on the channel about how I don't particularly like fantasy books. I don't particularly like heavy world building. This is a fantasy series, a book from a fantasy series I think is fantastic, and I will definitely finish it should it ever be finished. You can probably guess what that series is. It's the Game of Thrones series, or A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. So this book, A Feast of Crows, apparently is 1,106 pages. I couldn't, like the Tom Clancy books, I couldn't pick this one out. I couldn't tell you what the particular events of A Feast of Crows, A Feast for Crows rather, are. I've read I haven't yet read all of the books that are available in the Game of Thrones series, but I've definitely read this one, and I've really enjoyed all of them. They're all like 4 or 5 star reads for me. I think he manages to do world building in a way that doesn't feel too heavy to me, and I think it's because he uses things that are recognisable from our own world and our own history, to make it easier to digest the world that he's building. And also he uses language in an interesting way. So he introduces words which are similar, very similar to words in English, but slightly different, so that you don't have to think about what they mean. You can tell immediately what they mean, but they are different, so it does feel like you're in a different world. So I think he's great. The other thing I think he does really, really well is juggle multiple characters. So I always found with those books that despite the fact you jump between, the stories of lots of different characters, whenever you went back to a particular character, even if you hadn't been with them in the story for a couple of 100 pages, you immediately remember where you are and you can continue with their story. I think he does that really, really well. Just ahead of that then, at 1,137 pages, another Tom Clancy book, The Bear and the Dragon. I think this one is about a conflict, well, as most of his books are, is about a conflict between, or maybe it's between China and Russia in this one, but yeah, I can't remember anything about it at all, but I have read it. And ahead of that, we have another Tom Clancy book, which again, I can't remember anything about, Executive Order, which is 1,273 pages. It does feel weird that I've read thousands and thousands of pages of Tom Clancy, and the only book really I could tell you anything about, I think, is The Hunt for Red October, the first book, which is probably the shortest one. And also I've definitely invested a lot of time in over the years, but not one whose work has particularly stuck with me. Moving on then into the final two. So what I have done in this list is I haven't included books that were like omnibuses, so where you've got multiple novels in one book. 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, then the next book in the list, kind of is that, in that I think it has been published in separate versions, separate instalments, if you like. I think there are technically 3 books to the series, but I read it as one book, and I think that's the way most people read it, so I've counted it as one book. So 1Q84 is a very weird science fiction novel. I really, really enjoyed it. I know some people don't like it. I know some people have problems with it, and I can kind of see why, but it's a fascinating book about like a slightly alternate version of Earth, where there's all sorts of weird stuff going on. You follow these characters through a series of increasingly odd events, but there's something just infectious about the book that I really, really loved. I flew through that book. And it's a book that reflects a lot on long books. So it's a book where he talks about other long books. He talks about In Search of Lost Time, for example, which is often considered to be the longest book, or the longest novel anyway. I found it a fascinating book. I really, really enjoyed it. I've only read, so that was the first Murakami book that I read. And it's an interesting one because people say don't read that one first because it's so long. I did read it first. I've only read one other thing by him, which was a collection of 2 novellas, which was published as Wind Pinball, and I can't remember now what the actual names of the 2 individual novellas are. But I didn't enjoy that nearly as much as 1Q84. I need to read some more stuff by him. I've got other stuff by him digitally, so I will go back to him at some point. But yeah, 1Q84 was my first taste of his work, and I really enjoyed it. And that I think, apart from The Dark Tower, is the book that I've read most recently. I think I read that not long before starting the channel. And the final book then, the longest book I'm sorry, did I say 1Q84 is 1,118 pages. So 7 pages ahead of that at 1,325 pages, the book that you probably guessed at the start will be the longest book that I've read, which is The Stand, the complete uncut edition by Stephen King. So I've never actually read the original edition of The Stand, despite being a King fan before the extended version came out. I got into King, I guess, when I was about 12, that's that kind of age. So, some of his books I read, pretty much as soon as they came out. But I never went back and read The Stand. I've gradually worked my way through his back catalogue at that point. But The Stand I didn't get to until in, I guess it was the early 90s, wasn't it, that the full version or the extended version came out. I never went back and read the original version. I'd like to do that at some point. I'll have to see if I can pick up a paperback copy of it for not too much money. Anyway, The Stand, so another epic story. Again, like it, you could definitely argue it's too long, but somehow he makes it work. I do think it's a more sprawling story than it goes all over the place. There's some quite significant kind of digressions in it and things like that. He goes off at tangents at times. And I'm not sure it's as cohesive a book as it. I'm not sure it works quite as well as it does, but I do still think it's a fantastic book, and definitely one that I've enjoyed, and I've read it I think twice, at least twice, maybe 3 times, and again it is one I may go back to at some point in my life. Anyway, those are the 10 longest books that I've read. I'm going to do a couple more videos in this longest books series. So I'm going to do one on 10 long books I think you should read, and another one on 10 long books I'm going to read at some point. So yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed that today. Let me know in the comments your favourite long books. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.